Hi, I'm Shannon Watkins, and I am here today with Wenyuan Wu. Ms. Wu is Executive Director of Californians for Equal Rights, which is a nonprofit in California dedicated to the principle of colorblind equal rights. Ms. Wu and her colleagues work to oppose legislative attempts to instate racial and gender preferences in government programs, including higher education. I'm talking with her today about affirmative action, what it is, why it's a flawed policy, and states' attempts to ban it. Wenyuan, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I appreciate it.
Shannon, thank you very much for having me on your program.
Okay, so to get started, here's my first question. Advocates of race-conscious admissions say that they help close the enrollment and achievement gaps for minorities. Is that true? Do minorities have better academic outcomes because of policies like affirmative action?
Well, before I can answer definitively that question, I think we should first and foremost examine the meaning and the historical evolution of affirmative action as a government policy. So affirmative action, when it was first instituted as a federal policy through President JFK's Executive Order 10925 in March 1961, it was supposed to be a policy for to guide federal contractors and federal employers so that they take affirmative action to ensure that the job applicants are employed and treated during the course of employment without regard to their race, color, creed, or national origin. So originally, affirmative action was a policy that's coined around the principle of non-discrimination to reflect squarely the letter and spirit of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, as well as the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. However, in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson issued Executive Order 11246, which overrode the JFK's non-discrimination principle of affirmative action. And that new executive order in 1965 required federal contractors to implement affirmative action plans to increase the participation of minorities and women in the workplace. So over time, affirmative action has actually morphed into a regime of policies, principles, and initiatives centered around the concept of preferential treatment. So when we talk about affirmative action today, in today's public dialogue, oftentimes we are not referring to the non-discrimination part of affirmative action, but the preferential part of affirmative action. So coming back to your question on whether affirmative action has helped minority applicants and minority students academically, I think the answer really depends on how you define affirmative action. If we define affirmative action in its actuality, which is synonymous with race-based preferences, my answer is no, it has not helped the intended beneficiaries that the policy has purported to benefit. So in reality, when we look at the say, for example, the academic achievement of underrepresented minorities at various privileged universities like Ivy League schools and some flagship state universities, you see that both the graduation and matriculation rates of underrepresented minorities have stayed stagnant or even declined in the last 35 years or so. In fact, 2017 New York Times article pointed out that even with affirmative action, Latino and African American students are nowadays more underrepresented at selective US colleges than 35 years ago. So what does that mean? That means that race-based affirmative action has not lifted up these intended beneficiaries. And in other ways, they are hurt. They are hurt in two ways. They are hurt by one, softer bigotry of low expectations, that they cannot compete with their peers from so-called overrepresented groups like Asian American students, Caucasian students, if they are not given racial preferences in large scales. And number two, they are hurt because when they are admitted into an academic institution on large scale racial preferences, they are not competing with their peers on an equal footing. So they are actually hurt by what a professor at UCLA, Professor Richard Sander has coined as academic mismatch.
No, that's a really interesting concept, and I'm glad that you brought that up. I have another question regarding Prop 209. So it was adopted in 1996. Prop 209 prohibits the state of California from discriminating against or granting preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public institutions. It essentially guarantees colorblind treatment. But there were efforts last year to repeal Prop 209. Why was there a push to repeal? What ended up happening?
Sure. So long story short, as you stated, in 1996, California became the first US state to ban race-based affirmative action at the state level through Prop 209. Prop 209 passed with a majority vote of a little over 55% back in 1996, when the state was way less progressive and way less racially diverse. However, there has been over the last 25 years, there have been several attempts to roll back this non-discrimination protection of equal rights in California. So when you examine the language of Prop 209, it mirrors the language of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it's essentially not a ban on affirmative action, it's a ban on racial preferences. So in other words, since 1996, affirmative action has never been absent or categorically outlawed in California. It's the type of affirmative action that veers into the territory of racial preferences that got banned by Prop 209. So last January, the California state legislature welcomed constitutional amendment called ACA 5, Assembly Constitutional Amendment number 5, introduced by Assemblywoman Shirley Weber, who is now the Secretary of State for California. So essentially, that ACA 5 was an upgraded version of SCA 5, Senate Constitutional Amendment number 5, which was introduced into the California State Senate in 2014 to reverse the California's ban on affirmative action in public education alone. However, ACA 5 was more comprehensive in that it sought to repeal the ban on race-based affirmative action, not only in public education, but also in public contracting and public employment. So the bill was introduced in the state legislature in last January. And as you know, the state legislature in California has had a Democratic supermajority for many years. As a result, the amendment ACA 5 sailed through the state legislature in a matter of 5 months. So by the end of June, the bill already got out of the state legislature. How did it do so? How did it accomplish its goal so quickly because of COVID-19. Number one, the state legislature enacted some emergency measures to fast track bills so that a lot of bills did not have to be heard in two committees in each level of the state legislature. Instead, ACA 5 only had to pass the State Assembly Education Committee and symbolically the State Assembly Appropriations Committee and the same counterparts in the State Senate. So it had a very smooth journey throughout the State House. And then, also the summer of racial reckoning happened last year nationally, which accelerated the passage of ACA 5. And when it got out of the state legislature, it became Proposition 16, which was voted down eventually on the state November state general election last year. And so I think the political capital and the cultural support, the social cultural support for repeal race-based affirmative action in California were very ripe last year due to a lot of contingencies, the contingency of the pandemic, the contingency of racial reckoning, and also the institutional support of a super majority Democratic state legislature. However, there has been a growing and stable national consensus, both in public opinion polls and on the ballot against racial preferences. As a result, Prop 16 was voted down overwhelmingly by 57.2% of the California electorate, which equated to about over 9.65 million voters last year. The bill became one of the largest electoral losses in California last year. And as a result, our campaign against Prop 16, which was known as No on 16 by Californians for Equal Rights, was one of the biggest winners in the state of California in the last election. And we did it with very, very little money. So we were outspent by a factor of almost 17-1. And this is only the financial part. We raised a little over $1.7 million, the No on 16 campaign, and the Yes on 16 campaign itself within the campaign. And we're not talking about the PACs supporting the campaign on the outskirts, right? They raised over $31 million, and they were endorsed by anyone who is someone in the state of California and nationally. Again, still we won. And that just shows that sometimes the establishment's interest or ideology do not align with the public opinions.
Wow, that's an incredible story. And so that was in the general election last year?
That's right.
Wow. I mean, that's very heartening to hear in the end how it failed. That was Prop 16?
That was Prop 16. In the end, I think the majority of Californians, just like the majority of Americans, they live in the middle, and they don't want anything that's so radical that the proponents of Prop 16 believed that we can fight discrimination by discrimination. So that's the essence of race-based affirmative action. Don't you agree? We cannot fight fire with fire, the bottom line.
Right. Well said. Your partner group is Students for Fair Admissions, which filed a lawsuit against UNC Chapel Hill for its race-conscious admissions practices. This is the same group that similarly sued Harvard. Could you tell us a little bit about the UNC Chapel Hill lawsuit?
Sure. So we've worked with Students for Fair Admissions since the beginning of our journey in California last year. Actually, SFFA was our biggest financial supporter they donated about $50,000 to our Non-16 campaign, becoming the single most biggest donor to the campaign because we didn't raise a lot of money. But beyond that partnership, which was confined to the campaign, we have also partnered up to support SFFA's various legal pursuits against race-conscious college admissions. In March this year, we filed a mixed brief in support of Students for Fair Admissions lawsuit against Harvard, specifically in support of the organization's certiorari filing to the US Supreme Court for the US Supreme Court to hear the Harvard case. So the UNC Chapel Hill case is very similar to the Harvard case in the sense of the general question. The question in both cases is not about whether or not these schools should ban affirmative action, but it is about whether or not these schools can use tools such as racial balancing, racial stereotyping, and higher standards to discriminate against a particular group of applicants so that they can achieve goals of proportionality in their student makeup. So in other words, affirmative action has not been on trial in both cases. What's on trial is to which extent these schools can use race as a factor in their admissions processes.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
And so my final question, the North Carolina legislature recently introduced a bill that aims to ban affirmative action in the state. If passed, North Carolina will be one of several states, including California, to ban affirmative action or the kind that you've been discussing. What is your view of the state's legislative efforts?
I support wholeheartedly this effort to ban discrimination in public employment, education, and contracting, according to this Senate bill in North Carolina. And if this bill passes the state legislature, North Carolina will become the 10th state in the United States to ban race-based affirmative action at the state level. So I welcome this effort. I think this is a good direction that the state legislature and the bill's authors are pursuing to reflect their public legislation or their public decision making from public opinions. So public opinions, for example, according to a 2019 Pew Research poll, over 74% of Americans do not support the consideration of race in college admissions. They support the merit-based consideration. And the same type of public opinions trends can also be found in similar polls like a 2016 Gallup poll, and also many other state ballot electoral results, such as the Non-16 vote in California, and a similar vote against a repeal on affirmative action in Washington state back in 2019. So the public has spoken. American people do not want racial preferences as a bandage to solve past discrimination or present inequities. We intuitively realize and recognize that even though we have these achievement gaps and racial disparities in many areas, not just education, but also wealth, but access to public services, etc., racial preference is not the answer. We have to make sure that when we legislate, when we devise public policies, we want to make sure that the solution is not worse understand the problem. And because of that, I think that the North Carolina State Senate is going in the right direction by trying to ban race-based affirmative action in the state of North Carolina.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.